Hello and welcome virtually to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My name is Christopher Sands and I'm director of the Canada Institute, and I'm particularly pleased to be here today for a discussion of a new book, The Legacy of 9/11, Views from North America, edited by Andrea Sharon, one of our panelists today, Alexander Mons, and Stéphane Roussel. Available everywhere fine books are sold from McGill Queen's University Press, just out this year. I want to start by introducing our panel and then turn it over to Andrea, who will be our sort of introducer of the overall topic of the book. We have with us, as I just mentioned, Andrea Sharon, who is a global fellow at the Canada Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We're very proud to claim her. She's also director of the Center for Defense and Security Studies and a professor of political studies at the University of Manitoba. Also with us, we have Anastasios Hroustlas, sorry to mangle your name, known by all as Saki because it's a lot easier to say, who is a professor of international relations at the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, ITAM, another shortcut to not mangle the Spanish. We also have with us Meredith Lilly, who's an associate professor in the Simon Reisman Chair in International Affairs at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. And finally, Kim Richard Nossel, professor emeritus in the Department of Political Studies and the Center for International and Defense Policy at Queen's University in beautiful Kingston, Ontario. That's our lineup, and I'm going to turn over now to Andrea to give us an introduction to this book.
Thanks very much. This book really started as we were approaching the 20th anniversary of 9/11 with what has been the legacy of this unbelievable event, which at the time, many authors were saying this was a game changer. And that, in fact, was the title of another book by Jonathan Paquin and Patrick James. But as we started to think about 20 years later and the ripple effects, we wanted to see if, in fact, it was true that everything had changed. And one of the first stumbling blocks, of course, was what is this thing called North America? Is it the North America of NORAD that includes just Canada and the United States? Is it the North America of NAFTA that includes Mexico as well? And so we decided to use a sort of adjusted PEST or PESTLE model where you look at the various elements of political, economic, and we had 4 sections to this book. So the first was really looking at this idea of how has it changed this thing we call North America. Then we looked at border trade and the economy. Next was security and society, and lastly was the defense of North America. We were assisted in this book with a number of students, and 3 of them are co-authors. We have Emily Walter, Elizabeth St. John, and we have Nabila de la Cruz Garcia. We also had 14 students assisting us, and that's why we dedicated this book to students. We realized as teachers, many of our students weren't born were born after 9/11. And so this is really a chance for us to explain to them why it is that 9/11 is this marker, especially in international relations, whenever we're talking about security, about why it was such an impactful event. We're really fortunate to have had General Ray Hinault, who at the time of 9/11 was Canada's chief of the defense staff, provide the foreword to us. So I don't want to give you all of the punchlines from the book, but one of the major conclusions we draw is that if 9/11 wasn't enough to have North America sort of hang together as 3 states that worked in an integrated fashion in all elements of politics, economics, society, technology, etc., what event would actually precipitate that sort of integration? And really, we think that 20 years out from 9/11, including events like COVID-19, some of the major economic recessions that we've all lived through, what we find is that maybe 9/11 helped Canada to become more Canada, Mexico to be more Mexico, and the United States to definitely be more of the United States. And that we seem to persist with this dumbbell model of dealing with each other. Mexico deals with the United States and Canada deals with the United States. And that seems to be the common denominator. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. The first section of the book deals with North America, and Kim Richard Nussel, your chapter appears in that section. Let me turn it to you to talk to that question that Andrea just raised about North America and how we understand it today.
Thanks very much, and thank you very much to the Wilson Center for hosting this. It's a great pleasure to be part of it. The chapter that Stéphane Roussel, one of the co-editors, and I wrote focuses essentially on how Canadians conceive of the world of global politics that they live in. And so in that sense, there is a bit of a connection to the question of how we conceptualize North America. But essentially what we did was to take a look at whether or not Canadians, as they looked at the world in at the turn of the century, just before 9/11, whether or not the perception of the way in which Canadians conceptualize Canada in the world has departed from that particular vision 20 years on. We entitled our chapter "A World Long Gone" to essentially stress the huge changes that have occurred in global politics since then, some of them directly related to 9/11, some of them only partially so and indirectly so. But if you look at global politics in the early 2020s and compare what we saw in the early 2000s, it seems to me that we can argue that it is indeed a world long gone. What struck Stéphane and me, however, was the degree to which Canadians, as they look at the world, continue to conceptualize that world in essentially an unchanging way. Canadians in the 1990s and early 2000s were firm internationalists. They believed in internationalism. They believed in the liberal world order. They believed in what can be called the American world of that era. We know that world is indeed in the process of radical shifting, partly because of the rise of China, partly because of the decisions in Moscow to challenge the United States, and of course, huge changes within the United States itself, some of them emerging from 9/11 and the wars that followed that event. But what's really interesting to Stéphane and me was the degree to which, when Canadians look at the world in the early 2000s, in the teens, and in the early 20s, they still conceptualize the world in internationalist terms. There, it seems to me, is an unwillingness on the part of Canadians as they look out there to reconceptualize the world in rather different terms. And so when we try to understand why it should be that Canadians, that the image that Canadians have about the world and the reality of the world out there should be so sharply different. Much of the chapter actually focuses on how we might understand this gap. And we essentially argue 2 points. The first is that there really has been no alternative to the general idea of internationalism that gripped the Canadian imagination in the 1950s, and that idea has persisted for 70 subsequent years. And partly this is because there has been no alternative way of conceptualizing the global order out there that has proved basically proved compelling to Canadians. To be sure, during the prime ministership of Stephen Harper and the Conservative Party of Canada between 2006 and 2015, there was a marked difference. But the return of Justin Trudeau and the Liberals in 2015, it can be argued essentially meant that the alternative vision of the world that Mr. Harper had was essentially never got entrenched in Canadian perceptions. And that continues, it seems to me, even today. The second reason why Canadians continue to see the world in internationalist terms, it seemed to us, was because of what we simply think of as the inertial factor. The fact is that Canadians have been encouraged by their governors, particularly since 2015, to think of the world in what essentially might be conceptualized as old-fashioned terms. And in particular, the government of Canada since 2015 has not really been willing to reconceptualize global politics, and certainly not to try and bring the public along in those terms. Canada hasn't had a formal re-examination of foreign policy since 2005, the last one by Prime Minister Paul Martin. And it seems to me that that one of the reasons why Canadians have the particular image that they do in the world is because their governors have essentially, in the last almost 20 years now, been hesitant to basically encourage Canadians to rethink the world. And so we get the odd phenomenon that the world has radically changed since 2001, but the way in which Canadians conceptualize their country in the world has essentially not. Thank you very much.
Kim, that was fascinating. Gave us quite a lot to think about. The next section of the book deals with borders, trade, and economics. And Meredith Lilly, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to the Wilson Center for hosting today's event. The chapter that I wrote about was together with my former graduate student, Emily Walter, now graduated. And what I wanted to look at was the legacy of 9/11 for the border from a trade perspective, excuse me, for the pandemic border closure, because at the time that we were tackling this book, I had agreed, I think probably the timing is I had agreed to work on this, and then the border closed and I had to start thinking about new issues. And I had worked with some graduate students several years earlier to examine systematically the effects of 9/11 on trade between Canada and the US for a separate journal. And so I wanted to continue that work. So Emily and I looked at what was really learned from the trade lessons from the 9/11 border closure when it came time to close again in 2020. because if we recall, during 2001, the border was closed unilaterally by the Americans under a very securitized policy. It made a lot of sense at the time. There was a lot of fear, a lot of confusion about what was going on. That closure was so sudden that there were images on the news of food spoiling on trucks that were waiting to cross the border. Auto manufacturing plants had closed for a period of time while components and parts were stuck on either side of the border. And it, for a short period of time, there was this acute sort of disaster feel at the border. Trucks lined up for kilometers, for instance. And although the border reopened a few days later and in time trade resumed, we actually felt a very long-term effects of that border disruption. We experienced systematic border thickening between Canada and the US for a number of years following 9/11. And it actually took years of dedicated efforts by governments in both countries to prioritize restoring safe and efficient trade between the two countries. And so what I wanted to do was understand that set of lessons and how they had or hadn't been applied when we looked at the 2020 border closure due to the pandemic, which obviously was closing for very different reasons. But from a trade perspective, there were lessons that could be applied. And so what we found when we started analyzing the factors that went into the decision-making for the 2020 closure, a few things, and we know that the border closure was undertaken jointly in 2020. Citizens were given a few weeks to get back to their respective countries before they closed completely. And then governments worked together to avoid disruptions in trade. And so while travel and leisure and tourism was going to be denied, the goal of that closure is that goods trade would continue. And what we found when we started to analyze the factors is that actually from a goods trade perspective, the 2020 border closure was actually quite successful. While there was this very sharp decline in bilateral trade from March to June of 2020, this was actually because most of the world was under at-home orders. And so you will see that same V drop in every graph internationally with respect to trade. But by the summer of 2020, which was only 3 months later, Canada-US trade in goods had actually recovered. And by the fall, it had actually been, had surpassed 2019 levels, despite the fact that the border remained closed to travel and leisure. And so what we saw is that Canada-US trade actually recovered faster than Canadian trade with other countries during that post-pandemic period. Or, sorry, the pandemic was still raging, but after that initial closure. So a couple of the things that we think were critical to this success, one was that the joint nature of the closure was really paramount. Evidence came out that the Trump administration at the time was considering militarizing the border with Canada as well as Mexico. And if that had happened, it really, I think, would have been devastating, both to bilateral relations, but also to the kind of long-term trading relationship. A second factor that we think was really critical was that there was an automatic expiry clause that was built into the 2020 policy. And so that meant that the border would automatically reopen each month unless officials in both countries agreed to maintain the closure. And so the reason that expiry clause is important is because it both forced officials to meet every month to discuss whether or not the continuing closure made sense. Because it's easy to forget that government officials just get busy with a whole bunch of things. And sometimes a policy will remain in effect even though it isn't useful anymore. And then the second thing is that it told them every month they had to recall that having an open border is the way the relationship is supposed to be. And having a closed border should not be the normal situation. So I will mention a couple of the setbacks, though, that occurred in both the 2001 and 2020 closures. that I should mention, I'm not sure a lot could have been done about them other than just not closing the border. We know that small business was disproportionately hurt during both closures. In 2020, some of this was because there was a major shift to online shopping, and large multinationals really had that kind of game in hand, whereas a lot of small businesses just weren't prepared and weren't able to kind of handle the shift to the online world quickly. We also know that services trade was very badly hurt in the 2020 border closure. We have a lot less evidence about services trade in the 2001 closure. But it was by design that services trade was going to be hurt. The major category of services trade for Canada is travel and tourism. So if you ban travel and tourism, then you're going to hurt those figures. So it was kind of by design. And a final factor was that in both the 9/11 and the 2020 closures, there was a phenomenon known as, it's been labeled the unfriendly border. And it's this idea that when you do cross the border, you're subject to security policies that really kind of make you not want to enter the other country. And in post 9/11, that was very much felt by Canadians trying to enter the United States. 2020, if anything, arguably, it was Americans feeling that way about coming to Canada. There were lots of stories at the time of American property owners, people that had family in both countries, divorced couples with joint custody who couldn't see their own children. And neither country was particularly permissive about this, but Canada was distinctly unfriendly from the perspective of Americans at the time. But you know, what we concluded on the whole was that the painful events of 9/11 actually did teach officials in both countries some important lessons about trade, that maintaining goods trade was important, and they put the right levers in place for that to happen. Some have since speculated, and this kind of came around when we were starting to think about reopening the border, that we had actually almost been too successful in that endeavor. And this, what I mean by that is that Canadians didn't really feel a lot of trade pain during the 2020 closure. The grocery stores were still full of fresh produce that had all pretty much come from the United States or Mexico. They could still mostly buy the things that they wanted to buy, certainly the necessities. And so there was not a lot of pressure from the public to reopen the border for trade reasons. And instead, that other pressure coming from just good bilateral relations, people-to-people ties, all of those pressures weren't enough to overcome kind of the lack of urgency that was felt, because goods trade was remained relatively smooth. So, you know, it was a bit of an ironic little piece that was learned out of that.
Meredith Lilly, thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive review, and I remember that period very keenly, and some of the reactions to both the 2020 border closures and 9/11. I hadn't put them together, and I think that was fascinating. That sense of urgency brings me now to remind our audience that we will go to audience questions at a certain point. You can use the Wilson website if you're watching live. Obviously, if you're watching recording, won't work, to put in some questions, and we'll get to those questions after our next two interveners. I'm going to start with Athanasios Ristoulas from ITAM. Athanasios, Saki, your
Yes.
section was on security and society, and I think bringing also the Mexican perspective forward. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to Chris for organizing this. It's timely, and I think it's important that we should be discussing these kinds of issues. And I'm quite happy about how the book turned out. My specific chapter, the section that I was writing in, was on security and society, and I specifically looked at the case of Mexico and how Mexican security cooperation evolved over the last since 9/11, over the last 20 years or so. And the chapter essentially argues that many of the post 9/11 mechanisms that were put in place by Mexico, this kind of very pro-North American position that the different governments leading up to the present one, Andrés Manuel López Obrador as president, so-called AMLO, that the three presidents leading up to this particular presidency had really made a concerted effort to try to encourage a political environment where North America, where Mexico was viewed as a member of North America, and that Canada and the United States were viewed as partners, partner nations. And that they also kind of put their money where their mouth was, where they did actually implement a number of policies that demonstrated a commitment to North America and its partners, specifically, obviously, with the United States more so than with Canada. And the argument ultimately of the chapter is that it's pretty impressive how so many of these mechanisms that were established under these three previous presidencies under Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderón, and Peña Nieto, how these mechanisms that had been established under these previous presidencies have essentially been, I don't want to use the word gutted, I think it's a little too strong, but have been severely impacted in a negative way by the presidency of López Obrador. And from my perspective, being a North American, in the sense that I'm a Canadian living and working in Mexico, and also believing that security cooperation actually is a good thing. I'm a little disheartened. I'm a little upset on a personal level about the fact that this has actually happened under this particular administration. I first moved here in the late 90s, mid-late 90s, where there was the beginning of a shift in Mexico away from this kind of 1970s anti-Americanism, anti-imperialism kind of rhetoric that had been typical of so many of the presidents at the time, to a Mexico that was beginning to view, again, North America or Canada and the United States as partners, and it seems as though we've kind of gone back to that in the last 4 or 5 years. So to quickly run through some of the highlights of the chapter, I first go through how security cooperation began, and essentially the trigger for security cooperation between Mexico and United States and Canada was in fact 9/11. It was kind of sort of our North America's World War II moment, as compared to the Europeans to some extent, but it certainly was that certainly was the case as far as Mexico was concerned. And the panic on the part of Mexico was kind of similar panic that the Canadians were going through. I mean, why the need for security cooperation? Because, well, sort of like what Meredith was arguing a few moments ago about the shutting down of the borders. It kind of necessitated this security cooperation. We got to figure out a way how to keep these borders open for economic reasons. For the first time, North America had become this kind of security space. For so many years leading up to 9/11, North America, if it was a space, it was essentially more of an economic space. But with 9/11, all of a sudden it becomes a security space, and there were a number of policies that were implemented, that were agreed upon during the different administrations to show a commitment to North America on the part of Mexico. Specifically with regards to 9/11, the Fox administration signed a smart border agreement very similar to what Canada and the United States signed. And from the Mexican perspective, they saw this as kind of step one towards something that was going to be much more deep, much more profound. But then there was a bit of a shift in Mexico where the emphasis now was with the next president, Calderon, wasn't so much on 9/11, was much more focused on the issue of drugs. And I guess you can look at that as the beginning of the parting of ways. However, what did remain the same was the fact that Calderon was in fact still committed to cooperating with the United States and with Canada, broadly speaking, on security issues. And that and I guess the highlight project under Calderon was the so-called Merida initiative, that I suspect a number of you might be familiar with. And we can say a little bit more about that perhaps in the question and answer period. That continued into the next administration, this project, the Merida Initiative project. And then López Obrador comes in to play. And the rhetoric begins to change. He starts during his campaign that kind of typical anti-American, neo-liberal rhetoric that was so common back then, makes a comeback in his campaign, and it continues during his the beginning of his presidency. And he kind of put his money where his mouth was, in the sense that many of these projects that had been established under these other administrations were canceled. One of the most important one was, in fact, the Merida Initiative itself, which had survived 2 presidencies, but started with Calderon, continued with Peña Nieto, but now was officially canceled under López Obrador. And what I do in the chapter is I go through a number of different areas where you can very clearly see how things have changed under this administration, and how, in a very important way, Mexico has gone back to the way things were, sort of highlighting a little bit what Andrea said, I'm sorry, in the beginning of the session, where we've kind of gone back to our, kind of default roles. Mexico certainly has gone back to its default role, of the 1970s, in fact. We'll have to wait and see if this continues with the next administration. There are elections coming up. Hopefully some of these mechanisms that were torn down will make a comeback. I'm not particularly optimistic that will be the case, but just to finish, if the title of the paper of the chapter is 2 steps forward, 2 steps backwards, and then the 2 dots and something comes after that. But the 2 steps forward, two steps backward comes from the fact that under these initial post 9/11 administrations, Mexico made some headway towards enhancing cooperation. And the 2 steps backwards is from the fact that López Obrador has kind of brought us back to where we started. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much. There is a lot to unpack there. In a way, if the 19th century, we in North America figured out our borders and stopped fighting quite so much over them, fought about them quite a bit. In the 20th century, we started to feel, well, with good neighbors, we were safe from the troubles of the world because we were protected by 2 big oceans on either side, and it seemed like a secure place. 9/11 changed that for many of us,
Yep.
Made it feel like the threats had come very close. The last section of the book deals with defense of North America. And Andrea, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, thanks very much. So many of the authors, and there were 26, all of us, other than maybe the students, remember exactly where we were on 9/11. It's burned in our brains. And the 9/11 Commission report, which was a bestseller at the time, sort of outlined how did we get to this point, and, outlined all of the failures of the various intelligence agencies to not see the signs that something was going to happen. And of course, NORAD features, but it ends with the day when NORAD didn't prevent this attack and fundamentally failed in its primary mission at the time, which was to defend North America against an aerospace threat. But what's really remarkable about the 9/11 Commission report is it says absolutely nothing about Mexico and only mentions Canada insofar as it's connected to NORAD. So we wanted to do a deep dive on what were in fact the events of the day as they related to NORAD, and how did NORAD change after the fact? Because NORAD had to deal with these behemoth new organizations that the US implemented, Homeland Security, and this new combatant command, US Northcom. I mean, the amazing thing is before 9/11, there was no combatant command with eyes on the homeland. The assumption was always that wars, what happened after 9/11, let's take the fight to Afghanistan to keep the threat as far away from possible, continues to be sort of the default of the Canadian and US militaries. But NORAD had to navigate this new combatant command and ask some questions about why was it unable to detect the 9/11 attacks. And we're talking about NORAD modernization today, but arguably one of the biggest modernizations of NORAD was after 9/11, because it realized it was focusing entirely outward. So looking at the approaches to North America, it never considered looking inside North America. It wasn't even receiving the FAA feeds, let alone the feeds from Transport Canada about civilian airspace. And so it all of a sudden changed that. It meant that new civilian agencies like the US Coast Guard, which can be military or civilian, actually became part of NORAD because of a new mission, maritime warning, that NORAD took on. NORAD created these new operations called Operation Noble Eagle. They persist today, where you have essentially these no-fly zones over particular parts of North America, especially wherever the president is, but also when you have these big events like the Olympics, like the G7. That was all new, and that was all a response to 9/11. And so the conclusion we've made is that the NORAD of today is very, very different from the NORAD that failed to respond to 9/11, as did so many intelligence and other security organizations. We're now in this new period of NORAD modernization being the priority for both Canada and the US, but that pull to dealing with threats away from North America, I worry, is going to make NORAD modernization a second or third order priority, especially as we worry about Russian aggression against Ukraine. And again, that navigation of how do we respond to this increased vulnerability that the US feels. It has never had to deal with two peer or near peer competitors at the same time since possibly World War I. And now it's dealing with both, and a realization that successive administrations in both Canada and the US don't prioritize defense of the homeland, or continental defense, as Canada calls it. And we don't even consider Mexico. We just assume they are part of the area of responsibility and forget, for example, that Mexico has liaison officers as part of US Northcom. And so really, this is a chance for us to fundamentally rethink this command called NORAD. Who should be a part of it? Maybe we should have new states being part of it. For example, a future independent Greenland. Mexico may be in a position to join NORAD, so that there is maybe a chance that we'll have a North America that's actually on the same page. But fundamentally today, Mexico, the US, and Canada see threats to its country and its neighbors very, very differently.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And I'll just remind our viewers, if you're watching live, that you can put questions to us, to the panelists, through the website. Instructions are right there underneath the screen you're watching now. We already have a couple of questions, and the first one comes to us anonymously, but asks, after 9/11, a number of people in troubled parts of the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Middle East, made their way to North America to escape some of the trouble and turmoil. Canada, the United States, maybe to some extent Mexico, seeing new entrance into North America. Can any of you address that, how that changed the three countries, and about Islamophobia or xenophobia in its various forms? Did we see what we expected to see on 9/11 and after, or was it better or worse than some had projected? I have to look to you, raise your hand to tell me who wants to respond, though, I'm afraid. Anyone want to go?
Well, I can start. And
Perfect.
we have sort of two sections of the book that deal with that. One is on sort of looking at the border, and there's a fabulous chapter on the rebordering and debordering, especially between Canada and the US, but also Mexico and the US, and how we dealt with the issue of migration of people through those borders. There is also that whole section on society that looked at how did people feel about security in the three countries. And we know time and time again that we all had a crash course on religion and culture as a result of 9/11, and most of us got it very, very badly. I mean, anybody who was brown or black would feel the animosity of and the attacks of 9/11 were attributed to them because they were quote unquote different. We note that the number who were killed who were Mexican as a result of 9/11 has never been formally established, and that has to do with the migration policies between Mexico and the US, and the number of Mexicans who were workers and laborers and are undervalued, and nobody thought to, for example, count them when the Twin Towers fell. So we deal with this in a number of ways. And then we have the chapter from Justin Massey, who looks at what was the result of 9/11 and the ultimate result of the of Afghanistan, and that starts as a UN mission, becomes a NATO mission. And then the book also traces the disastrous pullout that was tied to this arbitrary anniversary of the 20th anniversary of 9/11 coming out, that forced the US and the allies who were still there to retreat very, very quickly, and how that has continued to impact that part of the world. And certainly nobody is feeling the lasting legacy of 9/11 more than women and girls in Afghanistan.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrea. My colleague, Andrew Rudman, director of the Mexico Institute, has a question for Dr. Ristoulis. He says, you noted the backtracking to Mexico's default 1970s position vis-a-vis cooperation with the US, first with President Trump and now with President Biden. What changes, if any, might we expect following the 2024 election in both the US and Mexico? Are we ready for a reset?
You know, we're not supposed to have crystal balls as academics, but we often pretend we have one. It's kind of a obviously it's a tough call, and perhaps the 1970s may have been a bit of a exaggeration for an effect, but there certainly has been a rollback of some kind. I guess the three main candidates that are out there right now, two of them look, two of them coming from, I guess the remnants of Andrés Manuel López's Obrador's party, and the third candidate. All three of them seem to have a much more soft. Well, no, that's not the case. At least two of them seem to have a much more soft position on vis-a-vis cooperation with the United States and Canada, specifically Claudia Sheinbaum, who is the official candidate for Morena and AMLO's party, and also Xochitl, who has recently been chosen as the candidate for the coalition of quite literally every other political party. And I wanted to highlight that one of the few times I think that I can think of where the two main contenders in an election are women. I think that's quite impressive and very, very good news. But the third candidate, who hasn't quite announced whether or not he will be a candidate, who sort of got sidelined by Morena's party just recently, the party that Claudia Sheinbaum now is the official candidate. He might decide to run as a third candidate, and he was previously foreign minister. While he was foreign minister, some of the more interesting, if I can put it that way, some of the more interesting policies vis-a-vis the United States were implemented. Many, if not all of them, rather troublesome vis-a-vis the relationship with the United States. Now, it's not clear that at all that he will be the president. He would have to run as an independent. So I guess my answer to that question is if it's Claudia or Xochitl, we're probably likely to see a bit of a recovery. Much more likely the case if it's Xochitl rather than Claudia. But if it's the third independent candidate, Marcelo Ebrard, I think we're much more likely to see a continuation of this kind of distancing from the United States and Canada in terms of security cooperation.
Thank you very much for that.
That's as far as my crystal ball can see.
It's perfectly far enough for today. We have another question, and I'm going to direct this to you, Kim Nossel. It's a question about intelligence sharing. Before 9/11, our border documents were often just at least for the Canada-US border, just a driver's license. We've seen upgrades to security of documents, so on, but we've also seen our intelligence agencies looking at counter-radicalization and other things. Can you speak a little bit to how 9/11 changed the way in which our security services, our intelligence agencies, not the uniform military, but some of these other parts of our foreign policy establishment, our security establishment, grew to work together more closely, or perhaps not as much, with the trust was eroded?
Well, I think that I'm by no means an expert on intelligence agencies and intelligence sharing, but generally speaking, it seems to me that 9/11 ended up focusing the attention far more on border security. Certainly on the Canadian side, the willingness to take, for example, Canadian passports more seriously was a noticeable change and very much a consequence of 9/11. The border, as all of us know, grew a little thicker as a consequence. Whether or not that was a function of a change in the way in which intelligence agencies interacted with one another across the border, I just can't say.
Fair enough. Does anyone else want to jump in on that? I see you, Meredith, have your hand up.
I will, because Jeffrey Hale of University of Lethbridge has written about the securitization of American policy in general towards foreign affairs and policies with Canada. So it wasn't just the intelligence agencies, but he argues all aspects of bilateral policy were seen through a security lens following 9/11. And so he's documented cases around even things like food inspection, regulatory cooperation, all these things. Exceptionalism became acceptable post 9/11 rather than harmonization of regulations. And because doing things differently was a way to actually keep the border thicker, right? And so it became built into policies for a good 5-10 year period post 9/11, and that is what led President Obama and Prime Minister Harper to work together on the Beyond the Border policies, as well as the Regulatory Cooperation Council, to start to push officials to ask genuine questions about why do we have different car seat standards for children in the United States versus Canada, and does that make any sense? Surely we all want our children to be equally safe. And so there's actually quite a clear line that can be drawn between the securitization of policy in general as a result of 9/11, and it took a lot of concerted effort to push against that, and we're starting to see it creep up again now, I would argue, for the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll take the opportunity to actually show the book. But we also have a couple of chapters. John Gilmer, for example, asked the question, did Canada copy the US in its creation of public safety for homeland security? And then Veronica Kitchen wrote a terrific chapter on looking at the layered but not integrated policing approach between Canada and the United States. And then, of course, Saki and Nabila de la Cruz, who wrote a chapter with me looking at all the events of how Mexico and Canada had to react to the US, and the various intelligence creation and sharing arrangements that had to be made. Especially, you know, I know Saki has written about this a lot, but there was a moment in time where we had this security prosperity partnership between the three amigos after 9/11, and we thought, this is Canada, the US, and Mexico getting on the same page with not only NAFTA but also security issues, and it just kind of fizzled. It just disappeared one night. The website wasn't updated, and that was sort of the end of the SPP. So there's lots in the book about these sorts of issues.
Saki, you got a shout out there. Do you want to jump in as well?
Well, I want to say something about the comment with respect to the securitization of the relationship. You know, my sense as far as Mexico is concerned, that the pending agenda after 9/11 was essentially security issues, and a lot of the debates and discussions that took place, the economic part of the relationship was all set, and what was, I guess, you know, left to determine was what this kind of, where this was going to go, where 9/11 was going to take us. And Andrea just mentioned the SPP was sort of like this moment of optimism, where it was kind of like our Maastricht moment, perhaps, where you know, we were going to have an agreement plus security cooperation, a trade agreement plus security cooperation, plus a whole bunch of other things as well. But on the issue of securitization of the relationship, Mexico and the United States, the relationship essentially became securitized, and that was kind of the first time that they were sitting down and talking about security issues. The difference between, I guess, the immediate post 9/11 period was the the relationship was securitized because of 9/11, because of the terrorist attacks. But the way the two sides, or the way the two countries approached it, was to seek ways in which that they could cooperate in order to manage the threat. And then even when there's a shift afterwards, where it's no longer so much about terrorism, but it's now about drugs and organized crime and so forth, the relationship is heavily securitized. But that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, because again, the two partners are looking for ways in which to work together to deal with the issue of organized crime, et cetera. And the Merida Initiative was an example of that. We still have a securitized relationship. Pretty much everything that you see on the news coming out in Mexico nowadays is about security stuff, but it's from a very, very negative kind of perspective, where you have the evil Americans, and they've even managed to. I mean, Lopez Obrador has even managed to call Canadians imperialists. We're a lot of things. Imperialists, I never quite heard that one. So it's almost as if Lopez Obrador has gone on a verbal war with both its North American partners, and of course it has a lot to do with politics, right? I mean, it's about domestic consumption and so forth. But the securitization of the relationship, and this is, I think, what I wanted to finish up by saying, wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the first 18 years after 9/11. Now the securitization of a relationship is probably being looked at as a bad thing. I'll leave it at that as well.
Thank you very much. So we're entering the last few minutes of our conversation, so I'm going to do a bit of a speed round with all of you. Now, the dedication of this book is to the students that you have who didn't live through 9/11 but have lived through its consequences. It won't be long, well, sometimes it seems like it'll be a long time, before they're running North America. So if I could ask each of you to kind of, if you can be optimistic, but what could be done to sort of get rid of the bad legacy of 9/11, maybe embrace something that we could go back to, or that would be new, that would help prepare us for future crises? Lessons from this book, but what advice would you have for that rising generation? What should they not do, a mistake they shouldn't make again, or what should they take away that could make our community better? And I'm going to go in the order we originally started with, starting with you, Andrea.
So, I mean, the amazing thing about our student generation is how widely traveled they are. They often speak many, many languages, and they're always thinking about others. And so I really don't think that generation will be stuck in the lens of, what's in it for Canada, what's in it for the US, what's in it for Mexico. They will have traveled to all these countries. They probably have family and friends connected to these countries. And so I think the hope is that they can make that integration is natural for them.
Excellent. Thank you. Kim Nossel.
I think that if there was one lesson that stands out about 9/11, is the importance of not overreacting. My reading of all of our chapters is essentially that one of the things that stands out is the degree to which, in the wake of a huge crisis of the magnitude of 9/11, is a tendency on the part of politicians in particular to overreact, to politicize, to bluntly put, score cheap political points. And and we know that there will be major crises ahead that our students in the future will face, I think that it's an important lesson to ensure that one sit and be far more calm than we have seen in the previous couple of decades.
Excellent. Meredith Lilly.
Similar to Kim, I would say that I think it's very easy to put up walls, and it is actually a lot harder to take them down. And so when we think about securitizing the border, when we think about border closures, I don't like to think that there will be another one in our future, but none of us anticipated these other two that happened. And as I think about some events in both of our countries moving forward, there's domestic events that don't always bode really well. So I think it's essential to try and demonstrate restraint, try and keep the doors open and the lines of communication open, because once those doors are closed, it's hard to open them, but it's also easy to then kind of other the other side. It becomes much easier to demonize and show all the ways in which that other country is a bad place. And so I think that that restraint is important.
Very good. Saki?
Yeah. With specific reference to North America, I think the lesson of the last couple of decades and working together is concerned is that I think we tried as three nations, as three countries, to go a little too fast in terms of looking for solutions to how to manage the threat. It brings to mind once again, I'll mention the SPP, the Security and Prosperity Partnership, which was kind of this catch-all, everything you ever wanted to have in an agreement about how to work together, which was agreed upon within a couple of months or so, or a couple of years, very, very short period of time. It was almost like doomed to fail. Because my sense is that we were trying to move a little too fast, at least from the Mexican side. The relationship between the United States was already there on these kinds of issues, and for Canada and the U.S., excuse me, it was really a matter of just tweaking some areas. Mexico had a lot of catching up to do, and Mexico tried to catch up, I think, a little too fast. And the end result was the political system just simply couldn't absorb these changes that were taking place. Everything was just happening way too fast. So if we ever happen to, I hope it doesn't happen, we ever happen to face a similar circumstance where the three countries have to work together, I think we have to move a little bit more slowly in the future. Otherwise, we may be in a situation where we are right now, where 20 years later, we're kind of right back where we started.
Well, thank you all very much. We've come to the end of our time, so I'd like to remind everyone who's watching, we've been talking about a new book, The Legacy of 9/11, Views from North America, published by McGill Queen's University Press. There is a cover of the book Andrea's showing. We also have a link to the publisher's website on the website of the Wilson Center where you're watching this right now, so you can follow up, get more details, find out about the other contributors and what some of the titles of chapters have been. But I've been very grateful to have Andrea Sharon, Kim Richard Nossel, Meredith Lilly, Athanasios Ristoulas here to share the book. I want to also thank the Mexico Institute here at the Woodrow Wilson Center that very kindly co-sponsored the event. And I have to thank Tracy Fitzgerald, the Wilson AV team. They kept us on track. Thank you very much. And thank you, the viewers. We wouldn't be talking except to ourselves without you. And we hope you'll come back to another Wilson event very soon.